welcome to Groundbreakers with Charles and Alice Dagit. Hi, I'm Alice. Groundbreakers is a show about the history of American architecture, and specifically, how it's been molded by the American dream, the American character, which simply bursts with ingenuity and invention. Winston Churchill said, "We shape our buildings and they shape us." Our culture and very way of life are embedded in our buildings. The way we live in houses and work in offices, the way we recreate, all are influenced by the buildings we use. Design informs everything we touch and experience. In this series, we will discover the ways in which architects and their designs have been molded by our culture, our economics, our environment, our social and political fabric. We will be going from place to place through an historical timeline to show how these influences indelibly shaped the architecture we have today. This is the American story of innovation and entrepreneurial spirit that has created our architectural treasures. We hope that as you walk around your towns and cities, you will look up with renewed curiosity and ask, how come? Last time we began with an exploration of the architecture of Maryland and Virginia, from Georgian plantation houses through William Buckland, perhaps America's first architect, and culminating in Thomas Jefferson's exquisite buildings. Jefferson's perfection, it can be argued, stifled architecture for about 60 years until the Civil War. But with the Civil War came economic, social, political, and cultural influences that enabled gifted architects to emerge to preeminence. Today we will focus on the architecture of the post-Civil War period's two prominent cities, Philadelphia, with native son Frank Ferness, and Boston, home to H.H. Richardson. We have with us award-winning architect Charles Dagit, who holds Pennsylvania's coveted Medal of Distinction. A member of the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects, Charles has won over 60 national, local, and regional design awards. And he has written a fascinating book on this very subject. Welcome, Charlie.
Hi there.
Why don't you refresh our memories about what we talked about last time?
Well, we spoke last time about the architecture of the two colonies, Maryland and Virginia, and how distinctly they were in terms of their culture, their way of life, the landed gentry of the Virginians, the merchants, traders, and so on, the nouveau riche of the Marylanders, and particularly in Annapolis. And we also talked about the architecture of Jefferson. And Jefferson, as you made mention, I believe, created a situation where American architecture really stumbled for a while in terms of creativity, because his architecture was so terrific and so perfect that no one wanted to venture any direction away from what Jefferson was doing. And Jefferson appointed Benjamin Henry Latrobe as overseer of the Capitol. And they were creating this new Capitol. It was designed by a Frenchman named L'Enfant. He designed the city, and Henry Latrobe was responsible for overseeing the construction of the buildings that were a part of Washington, D.C. And Henry Latrobe was a avowed classical architect. And so he appointed a number of architects. There was a competition for the White House, and James Hoban won the competition, obviously in the classical style. And Latrobe influenced people like Strickland, who was a Philadelphia architect who designed the Second Bank of the United States and the Merchants Exchange building. He also was very influential to Thomas U. Walter, who ultimately ended up designing and supervising the construction of the Capitol building, all of which are purely classical buildings. And that brings us to taking a look again at Monticello, the University of Virginia, and the Capitol at Richmond were these classical buildings. And I forgot to mention the University of Virginia, the scheme of the University of Virginia was to place the library in the center of the complex, or at the top of the complex, and all of the classrooms went down the hillside to create a wonderful lawn. And Jefferson focused that lawn on the Blue Ridge Mountains beyond. And what he said with the composition of that library at University of Virginia is, if you study in my library, go out to the lawn, it's all yours out there. The west is yours.
Oh, it looks westward.
Faces to the west. And Jefferson, as we know, was the man who appointed Lewis and Clark to go out and find the West.
That's right.
And he was very intrigued by the growth of the country. And the country followed Jefferson's model up until 1860. And then the Civil War occurred. There was no building, obviously, going on during the Civil War. And then the Civil War was over. And we move now to a place called Philadelphia, who everyone within this area knows quite well. And it was the largest, at the time in the Revolution, the largest English-speaking town besides London in the world. And it was a seaport. And its influence comes from the Quakers who founded the city, William Penn. And it was the home of Benjamin Franklin, a Bostoner who migrated to Philadelphia.
Lucky for us.
And he was an incredible inventive man, and obviously captured the idea of electricity for one. But he invented other things, the Benjamin stove, the Franklin stove, to be fired up in the center of the house rather than on the edge of the house, thereby keeping the heat in the house rather than just up the chimney. But he had incredible inventions. And because of his inventions, there were also institutions that were founded. And one of them was the University of Pennsylvania. And other institutions like the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts were first in the nation, or some of the first in the nation. Also, Philadelphia was influenced by Alexander Hamilton, who was the banker. And he invented banking in this country and created the first and second banks of the United States. And Philadelphia's influence with banking was enormous. We were the banking center of the country. And we also had coal and the railroads. And that was after the Civil War.
But they played a role in the Civil War as well, in winning the Civil War as well.
The railroads obviously had an enormous influence on winning the Civil War. Also had an enormous influence on the buildings that we built, because we were able now to haul massive stones and put them in place where you couldn't do it before with just a team of horses. So in Philadelphia, there arrived a man by the name of Frank Ferness. Frank Ferness is a very distinguished man, even right at the end of the Civil War. He's the only architect who ever won the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Oh, my.
In a battle that he partook in the Civil War. And he was an officer for the federal troops and got involved in a battle and won the Medal of Honor.
That's a factoid that this audience would love to know.
Yeah,
That's great.
He was an incredible man. He was the son of a first Unitarian preacher. And all of a sudden, for some reason, he became the darling of the Quaker bankers. And he practiced architecture simply by putting up his shingle. And he was not formally trained in any architecture during that time. He simply proclaimed himself an architect. The Quaker bankers, who one would assume would be very proper and trim, hired Frank Furness, who was a complete radical.
That's right. He wasn't doing anything like what was done before the Civil War.
He was a radical because America was ready for him, because we rejected the Thomas Jefferson model. at the end of the Civil War because it reminded people too much of the South. The stately South presentation of itself as a culture was not at all what the North was all about. The North was, as I said in the last episode, the North represented industry and manufacturing. And it was exactly what Hamilton wanted, urban quality and so on. And the federal style represented Jefferson's ideal of the stately plantation kind of place. And so the North was really ready to reject completely Jefferson's ideal. And it was embodied in the work of Frank Furness, who came along and essentially rejected everything about federal style architecture. His first building that I show is the Ferness Library at the University of Pennsylvania, which at the time was a building that caused a great deal of anxiety even on the campus because it didn't represent Gothic, stately, collegiate architecture. It represented a whole different new kind of a style. It was Victorian in many ways and very much influenced by the British Victorian architecture that was happening at the time. But completely quirky. I mean, it broke all of the rules. Jefferson's ideal was Roman proportions, stately columns and so on. And here comes Frank Furness with his library with a column that is squashed completely.
That's right. The Gothic had been soaring.
Yes, and
his is more stubby.
And the classical was just the stately proportions. And all of a sudden, he invents this column, which is yay tall and this wide, and completely throws off the establishment scene in Philadelphia, certainly, but also around the country. And he then creates this interior inside of the library, which is really startling, with all of these arched windows. And of course, the arch was out of fashion. It wasn't a part of the classical vocabulary.
Right.
So here's Frank Furness creating all these arched windows and using gargoyles of all things. And he was also doing some pretty fabulous things with metal. And in the interior of that library is a staircase with an absolutely embellished metal railing, which is incredible, with lights that are fabricated, electric lights, which is brand new. There were probably gas lights at the time, but he fabricates these incredible light fixtures, things that we don't ordinarily think about in terms of what's going on in Jefferson's architecture. They were of little concern to Jefferson, but for Frank Furness, it was a world of design. And even in the stained glass windows that are embellished all over that library, with quotes of famous people in the window and elaborate garnishing detail in the making of the window. So he begins to form a language of architecture that incorporates not only the column and the way to hold up the roof, but also incorporates the time clocks, the lamps, the handrails, and so on and so forth. He was very influenced by a man named Viollet-le-Duc in France, who wanted to conceive of, and he did, and he's the architect that put the spire on top of Notre Dame Cathedral that was burned down last spring. He was very involved in making Gothic architecture out of iron. And some of his buildings are reflective of that. And Frank Furness became very enamored of Viollet-le-Duc and looked at his work and the iron work that he did and created these incredible staircases that were absolutely fabulous at the time and unheard of in terms of the kind of architecture that he was fashioning. And if you look at some of the other buildings that he began to create, the Provident Life and Trust Company and the Guaranteed Trust, these are buildings that don't fit the norm at all.
They didn't look like other banking
They
buildings.
sure didn't look like other banking buildings. All looked like temples, and the Second Bank of the United States being the example.
Right.
These are buildings that are really mercantile buildings, and the reason why the classical architecture began to fall apart was that the programs that were contained within these buildings, and programs, I mean the spaces, the use of the spaces, didn't fit the temple mold. You couldn't fit a banking space into those kinds of spaces because you need clerical areas and so on and so forth. So classical architecture began to die on the advent of Frank Ferness.
So that would carry over to every form of architecture. Someone in the Industrial Revolution, that is what won the Civil War for the North, who needs a factory to fabricate his wares, or needs a sales space to sell his wares. They need something different. They need form to follow function.
Yeah. When you look at the buildings that were done in the late 1800s and early 1900s, for instance, our Philadelphia Art Museum, or for instance, the Supreme Court building in Washington, it doesn't fit the temple. So you have to branch out and build all this other stuff.
That's right.
And it clearly begins to
break
questions about, well, it's not really a temple. So, and in many ways it was very feeble to add all these additions onto the
a Greek temple.
Beautiful Greek temple, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we rejected the American classicism because of the Civil War, but we also, the classicism that Jefferson created rejected the colonial architecture because it represented Georgian architecture, King George and the American colonies. And the war, obviously, the Revolutionary War threw out Georgian colonial, and the Civil War threw out American federalism.
Interesting.
And so the resultant architecture that we see is Frank Furness's architecture, his very interesting use of color, and particularly when you look at the First Unitarian Church in Philadelphia. It's a wonderful interior space. And here Frank Furness has a chance to work for his father. And he did the First Unitarian Church in Philadelphia in that effort, and created an extraordinary palette of color. I had the privilege many years ago of reworking the interior of that church. And we put all the color back.
Oh.
It had kind of disappeared over the years. So we created the red ceiling that is in the space. It's a startling space for a church. I mean, you think about it. Usually the Protestant churches are all white and somewhat stark. The Catholic churches are stone. And here's Frank Furness doing this splash of incredible color. For what reason, I don't know, because I can't ask him, but in any event, they are pretty profound. And then we go to the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, his masterpiece building in Philadelphia. And he deviates, obviously, from classical architecture completely. And one of the things that is interesting within that building is the patterning.
Yeah.
And he becomes very, very curious about patterning materials. And so the interior staircase in that building, which is a incredible juxtaposition of scale. And you walk in the front door, you expect something gracious and so on, and the staircase is thrust right at you. and you're told to basically go up the stairs. And you go up the stairs into this room, which is patterned with this brilliant pattern of color. He is very enamored of the color of material and so on and so forth that becomes very striking.
That interior is it's just bursting with color. The reds and it's just extraordinary. Yeah. Every Philadelphian should step inside that building.
Absolutely, it's an exquisite building, and it's Frank Furness's masterpiece. Now, Frank Furness's architecture was criticized severely by the classical architects, obviously, at the time, and even after he died, the architecture was severely criticized. Many of his works, over 700 buildings, of which there are only 200 left, many of them were torn down because of the rejection of the style of Frank Furness.
And sort of a rejection of the Victorian too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Victorian age was an age of exuberance, like Frank Furness, and the stately classical architects did not like the exuberance of Furness's architecture. But one of the other interesting things about Frank Furness is he was enabled, because of his popularity at the time with the Quakers, he was enabled to build or to design one of our first major office buildings, and that was the Broad Street Station in Philadelphia. And it's huge. And it was the home of the largest railroad in the country. The Pennsylvania Railroad was the largest railroad in the country, in the world.
That's what I thought, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Pennsylvania Railroad at the time that the Broad Street Station was built was probably the largest stockholder-held company in the world.
Wow.
And so he designed that building, and it was really a forerunner of the American office building, because all of the offices that were necessary to run a railroad were in that building. So it was a gigantic building.
So this was, I've often
Been
wondered
torn down.
exactly where, yeah, it's been torn down, so I've often wondered exactly where it was, and I have discovered that it was right across from City Hall. City Hall
Yeah.
and it were built in the same decade or two, the 1870s or 80s.
Yep.
And, or begun anyway. City Hall wasn't completed then. But yeah, right there at Penn Square.
Yep. So we see in his buildings his sort of quirkiness in all aspects. I mean, the Arch Street building, the Philadelphia House that I show, they're extraordinary buildings that are unlike anything we've seen and deviate from the obvious Georgian and classical style completely. And he's
the robustness of it, the heaviness of them. Talk about City Hall. He did not design City Hall, but its piers are 22 feet wide.
Yeah.
It's as most people probably know, it's the largest masonry building in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, at one point, it and its style had fallen out of favor so much that the city looked into tearing it down, and they determined that the cost of deconstructing the building, the cost of tearing the building down would bankrupt the city. So we are very lucky to still have that world famous building now.
Yep.
But it went out of favor for a while, and that's true. It's such a tragedy to have lost so much of Furness's work.
Yeah. Furness obviously didn't do City Hall, but
No.
But the buildings that he did do, many of them were torn down.
Yeah.
In the 50s.
He did, actually, a lot of this audience is suburban, and he did a lot of houses for the railroad magnates along the main line.
Yeah.
A lot of residences.
And the Marion Cricket Club.
That's right.
He designed that building.
Uh-huh.
One of the things that's interesting, when we talk about the Broad Street Station and the railroad, it was, and I mentioned, it was the railroad that enabled Frank Furness to build something like the Ferness Library,
Why is
because
that?
the stones that are at the base of that library are enormous, and could not possibly have gotten there without the railroad.
Yeah, the facade, I have to say,
So-
I'm always fascinated by and enamored by the horseshoe end of that building.
Yeah.
Because the scale of the stones that are used to construct that are just outrageous.
They're huge.
Yeah.
And it's all because of the railroads.
How about that?
You couldn't possibly have gotten those stones to that building without the use of the railroad. And those stones come from out of state. They're not. They weren't quarried locally, so you had to haul them across states to get those stones to that library. So it's and City Hall is the same way. The stone in the City Hall comes about because of the railroads.
Yeah.
So technology was what was beginning to transform American architecture,
right.
as well as the idea of getting rid of what symbolized the South and so forth. It was all transformative that was going on.
Yeah, technology drove the change to this kind of architecture.
Yep.
Yeah.
So then we come to another architect, one of the.
What, are we leaving Philadelphia?
Yeah, we'll leave Philadelphia.
Oh, no.
And all aboard for Boston. One of the interesting things about Frank Furness and H.H. Richardson, Furness having fought in the Civil War, Richardson not, was that they were both born in the same year.
Oh,
Richardson was born in the South. He was a native New Orlander, and he grew up on a plantation. And he decided, knowing the Civil War was coming, that the wisest move for him to make was to go to France. And so in the 1860s, he left for France and he studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, which is the premier architectural school of the world. Richardson studied there, and interestingly enough, stayed there until 1865, and came back when the war was over.
wasn't that just convenient? And that was, let me just clarify, that the École des Beaux-Arts, which translates to the School of Fine Arts, was the preeminent, perhaps only, architecture school in the world?
Yep,
Okay.
at the time.
So, not many Americans, crossed the pond to go there.
No.
But any who wanted to be educated in architecture would have gone there.
Yeah, and the curriculum was very rigorous, and it was in the neoclassical style.
Okay.
So Sullivan comes back to the United States, and he goes to Boston. Richardson, I'm sorry. Richardson goes back to Boston.
But he's been educated in the classical style.
In the classical style. And he goes to Boston because Boston has incredible institutions there, MIT and Harvard. And it's also another seaport, like Philadelphia, and Annapolis. It is the home of more patent lawyers than any other city in the world.
Oh my goodness.
And it is the home of more inventions
Yeah.
than any other city in the world.
The one follows the other.
For instance, the telephone obviously was created in Boston. Incredible inventions occurred in Boston. But what made Boston so attractive to Richardson to come back to, rather than back to New Orleans, and of course the South was now in complete poverty. Boston could smell the money. Richardson could smell the money as well as anybody else. What propelled Boston at the time of the Civil War was the Singer sewing machine.
How so?
And the Singer sewing machine was the first machine to use a vertical needle rather than a horizontal of the weave.
And Mr. Singer was a Bostonian?
Singer was a Bostonian and created the Singer sewing machine. And because that sewing machine was so productive that the city of Boston produced almost all of the federal uniforms. at the time of the Civil War.
Oh,
So
now there's an economic engine.
out of Boston came millions of federal uniforms for the use of the troops.
And an engine for the textile industry in New England as
Yes,
well.
yes. And so Boston became the sort of center of textile in the country. And the people that propelled that textile revolution were all immigrants. And they were the Irish who came to Boston. And now in doing so, here they come to Boston, they come with hardly anything, and they work in the plants to produce all these federal uniforms. And the people in the migrants want and need both churches and education.
They're Irish. And
They're Irish.
They want
the
religion
churches
and education.
and they want their children educated.
Okay.
So Richardson is in Boston, and he starts designing churches and libraries all over New England.
He's a smarty, isn't he? Well, that's what the demand was, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
His first building is at Harvard, and it's called Austin Hall. And it's very similar in many ways to Frank Furness's buildings, because Richardson decided that the classical education that he had was all wrong. And he had, I should say at the time in Europe, there was an ongoing argument about Gothic architecture and classical architecture, what was appropriate. And was led by people like Pugin, who did the Parliament building in England, and others who were waving the flag for Gothic architecture. And
Ruskin was in that
Ruskin, the
school as well, that category?
it was the arts and crafts movement.
Oh, yeah.
That wanted to move to the crafted building, not the classical building. So what Richardson began to create, and people then termed it such, was called Richardsonian Romanesque architecture. Very heavy, using arches a lot. And interestingly enough, and I don't know how much Furness and Richardson knew each other, but his columns were stubby and short.
Yeah.
Unlike the classical proportioned columns.
And you could certainly apply the term Romanesque to Furness's style as well.
To a certain degree.
Yeah.
Although
Well, no, not a
can't-
perfect replication.
you can't categorize Furness's buildings.
Okay.
Not nearly like Richardson Romanesque.
Oh, I didn't know that you could categorize.
But Richardson had a fabulous kind of interesting notion about how the use of the Romanesque arch was used. And in Austin Hall, for instance, he sets up a rhythm of 3 columns and 2 columns and 3 columns and so on. And what he does is he takes this last arch and thrusts it into some tower and buries the arch. I mean, it's really incredibly perverse what he's doing.
It just disappears into a wall?
It just disappears into the wall. And he does that in a number of different places. He does that in the Wynn Memorial Library, where he sets up a rhythm of columns, and bam, he thrusts it into the entrance piece of the building. He's having an enormous amount of fun doing what he's doing, and he's doing it with, full intelligence of how this is going to be perceived. And they're extraordinary buildings, and perverse in many ways, and certainly breaking the rules. The classical architects of the time were absolutely amazed and furious over the work of Richardson.
And yet the clients were very open to this brand new, as you say, perverse style.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. They wouldn't be hiring
And
him
you see it happening in almost every building that he did, and he did all these libraries. The Crane Memorial Library, he does the same thing. He sets up a rhythm of columns and then thrusts an arch into the front entry. He makes an entrance out of an enormous arch and throws it into a tower and buries the arch.
Which building is that?
That's the Crane Memorial Library. And
although I guess you could say it for a lot of his buildings.
a lot of the buildings have very similar kinds of ways of thinking. He uses a trick in the Oak Ames, the Northeastern Railroad Station, where he hides the entrance. He has two giant arches, and both arches are entrances into the railroad station, and you can't tell which is which. He's enjoying it immensely. The traveler standing at the station is, how do I get in here? And Richardson is laughing all the way. And
To the bank, so to speak.
the bank, yes. At the Oak Ames Memorial Library, the same thing. The Crane Memorial Library interior is absolutely exquisite, made of wood paneling and stuff. I mean, you know you're going in there to read a book. It screams that at you when you're sitting in the room. And you know to sit in that room with all due respect to people reading the book and in absolute quietude, because the room is so gracious.
Yeah.
It's just
And inspiring.
inspiring, absolutely inspiring. And his major commission in the town of Boston was the Trinity Church.
Oh, yeah.
And it's an extraordinary building. There he emulates English Gothic and Ely Cathedral. He puts the tower at the crossing, not in the front, so that the main tower of the building erupts from the center of the nave.
Okay.
And it's an extraordinary church. And also the thing that's interesting about that church is he too is looking at patterning. And he has some interesting patterning going on in both in the libraries that we're looking at here, the Crane Memorial Library, the Ames Library. He's carving into the stonework patterns in those libraries. And in the Trinity Church, he's using different color stones for a pattern in the front of the church. And it's a quite unique building for a church.
Different kinds of stone altogether.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
different colors,
Uh-huh.
like a mosaic.
Uh-huh.
And then his two final buildings are pretty extraordinary. Is the Allegheny Courthouse, which is in Pittsburgh. He is commissioned out of Boston to go to Pittsburgh to design an incredibly large building, and that too is an office building and a precursor to our new office buildings that are coming in the future. And he then moves on to Chicago, and he actually becomes, Furness did not, but Richardson becomes the first traveling architect. And he does a building in Pittsburgh, and then he does a building in Chicago. And he does the Glesner House in Chicago, which is an amazingly wonderful, wonderful piece of stonework. Actually exquisitely crafted stone building. And the entrance to the house is a big, gigantic arch, which we'll see later on. Frank Lloyd Wright begins to pick up on the giant arches that Richardson was using.
So the Glesner House is a very heavy, substantial building,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I'm right now thinking about it. I never thought about this before. It's almost It's almost fortress-like. It's almost like, am I right?
Yeah, he was inspired to a certain degree by the Italian
I was just going to say
villas.
this.
Yeah,
And I was going to say by the Florentian
yeah.
villas, yeah.
Only in pure stone, in granite, not in the limestone that the palaces used.
Oh, I see.
But he used precision granite for the stonework, which is pretty extraordinary.
Because limestone is easier to cut?
No, limestone's yes, limestone is easier to cut.
Okay.
Yeah, and we go back to technology driving the architecture. We now had the tools to be able to cut granite in ways that we didn't have before. So we were able to use machinery and the steam engine to provide us with saws and tools and things that we didn't have before. When I mean, you had to hand carve most of the stone. Most of the palaces are hand carved stone, and they were quarried with simple chisels and so on and so forth. They didn't have any saws of the size to be able to cut stone like we have now.
So you mentioned the steam powered, and I was thinking about New England having so much hydraulic power. Would that have been used too, or wasn't that adequate? You needed the steam power.
Yeah, you needed steam to be able to drive a saw to cut stone.
Right. Right.
That's pretty heavy lifting.
I was also thinking, I hadn't thought about, I mean, there are so many ways that you could compare Richardson and Furness for us, but you've just mentioned that he took it on the road, so to speak.
Yeah.
He went to Pittsburgh and to Chicago, and he was a traveler to begin with. He was born in New Orleans. He studied in Paris, Boston.
Yeah.
Whereas I never thought about this either, that Furness pretty much stayed put.
He was a homeboy.
Yeah.
He didn't build it anywhere else but in the city of Philadelphia and the suburbs.
Suburbs.
Yeah. So I don't think he, at the time, that he was nearly as well known as Richardson was well known, simply because of Richardson's connection to Harvard. And
Oh, right.
people who were graduating from Harvard were going outside of the local area. So a person from Chicago might go to Harvard and then go back to Chicago and say, oh, we know this architect.
Right.
And I don't think that Penn had that kind of influence at the time. So Furness's reputation stayed pretty compact in the Philadelphia area, whereas Richardson was known all over New England and did these libraries in many of the various towns. And once again, you know, the railroad propelled that ability to be able to supervise a building under construction from afar.
That's true. It's true, travel became easy.
Yep.
I have to mention to the audience that you just did something that we all fall into the trap of. We grew up calling that Philadelphia architect Furness.
Yeah.
And we all have to train ourselves to call him Furness, which is how he pronounced his name.
That's true.
So it's hard for us to remember to do that. But, but I know that there are people in the audience who have wondered which is the correct spelling.
Yeah.
So Furness is the correct spelling, like that heating generator you have in your house. So how else might you compare the two of them?
Well, I think they are both the result of the rejection of classical architecture.
Yeah.
And it was of the time. Because
it's so interesting that here they are, two men in two different areas with two different bits of education under their belts, and they choose to reject what went before, but they choose a very, very similar idiom in which to do it.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
I don't exactly know how much they knew of each other's work. Now, one would think that they would have seen the other person's work, but there wasn't that much transferal of what was going on in architecture at the time. There was no magazines of any kind that were, you know, professional magazines. So I'm as curious as anybody to figure out why the two of them at the almost identical times started using these squat columns.
Yeah.
What possessed them to deviate so strongly from the Roman proportioning of columns.
Richardson might have been influenced by the Romanesque in Europe.
He was, but they weren't using any kind of vocabulary like Ferness and Richardson at the time. The buildings that he knew of were in southern France and were Romanesque. But I don't think that there are that many examples of buildings with squat columns in them and that sort of thing that would have inspired him to take that back to America and create a new kind of an architecture. Now, maybe, I mean, I'm trying to think. There's a Romanesque church, Notre Dame, something or other. They all are, but anyway. In southern France, that is a very squat kind of an elevation that he may have seen at the time. I don't know.
You just made an allusion to something that is instructive, I think, because a lot of us Americans might not be aware of this. Tell me if I'm extracting accurate information from you. You're implying that most of the Romanesque is in southern France and most of the Gothic is in northern France. Is
Yes.
that right? Okay. I'm not sure that most Americans are aware of that.
Well, you would expect that being called Romanesque,
Yeah.
that it was influenced very much by the Roman architecture carried across the border to France. And most of southern France contained examples of European Romanesque, whereas the Gothic architecture began to grow out of Paris and northern France. And
England too.
and England now.
England followed suit.
It followed suit. England was about 100 years behind.
Okay.
Anything that was going on in Europe, England was about 100 years behind. So English Gothic architecture began to flourish about 100 years after, 14th and 15th century.
Okay.
Whereas the Chartres was 1100s. And all of the master builder masons went to France to study Gothic architecture.
Oh.
And then took that back to England to build the English cathedrals.
Okay.
So the influence of Gothic in England is trailing the French burgeoning of Gothic
It's
architecture.
following the example.
Yeah. So the Romanesque is being built at about 800 to 900 in that time frame, and its characteristic is a barrow vault, and that's where Richardson got the idea of this, using these arches out of the barrow vault of the Romanesque architecture.
Okay. And then the Gothic came along and
created
created
the pointed arch.
Right.
Right. And the thing that freed Gothic architecture to what it became was the flying buttress, which the Romanesque architects did not know about.
Yep. They just built things to be.
Well, they built their buildings out of mass
Right.
in order to hold the height of the building. And that's where Richardson gets this, and Furness as well,
also.
gets this massive kind of feeling in his architecture because he's using mass in the same way to achieve height, where Gothic architecture uses the flying buttress to make everything thin and light.
Do you think everyone in the audience knows exactly what a flying buttress is? You might explain that.
Well, when you build up an arched space, what happens is that the arch pushes on the walls. And if you're not careful, it'll push too much and the building will collapse. What the French did at around 1100 was invent what was called a flying buttress, and that was a piece of stone that came up and leaned against the walls to push against the thrust of that vault that was coming down.
And almost built something perpendicular to the wall.
Yeah.
To take that
A strut.
stress.
Basically, it was a strut to transfer the load that was coming down and pushing out, to transfer it down diagonally onto further and further down until it got to the ground. And that prevented the walls from buckling and collapsing. So it took the invention of the flying buttress to create the height of the Gothic cathedral. The Romanesques were stymied by the amount of mass that they had to create in order to create height. So they had to build real thick walls to keep that force going down rather than out.
And so that prevented the height that the Gothics were able to achieve.
Exactly.
And also, it prevented the drenching of sunlight that the Gothics were able to achieve also, because so much of the architecture had to be taken up by solid stuff as opposed to openings.
Right. I mentioned Bois-le-Duc, who was promoting kind of Gothic architecture in steel. Of course, the Gothics at the time did not have steel, so they had to build everything in masonry. And Bois-le-Duc was very convinced that you could make an architecture that would be true to steel as the Gothic architecture had been true to masonry. So he began inventing all of these steel forms. Ferness became very, very enamored of his steel work in his buildings. For instance, the staircase at Ferness Library and so forth are very much influenced by Bois-le-Duc.
You reminded me of him. This is not Furness, this is Richardson. You reminded me of Leduc when you mentioned Trinity Church in Boston, whose spire is in the center, is in the cross of the nave and the transepts.
Right.
Which is the case at Notre Dame in Paris as well, right?
No.
Oh no?
No. The only one that's similar is at Ely in England.
Okay.
Where the spire of the building is right in the center of the church, versus the typical Gothic cathedral has the two spires on the front end, the west end, the entrance end, and he transferred that to the center of the church, and there are very few examples of that.
In Ely.
Well, Ely transferred that into the center of the church, and then Richardson transposed Ely's cathedral onto the Boston Green and created Trinity Church.
I think it's timely that we're having this. I don't know whether you. I know that you didn't intend to be talking about Paris in this segment of this hour of the show, but it's timely because of the tragedy at Notre Dame, and if people are paying attention to that process, the destruction and the reconstruction, they'll see Bois-le-Duc's name frequently, because he was the leader a century ago of restoring Notre Dame.
Yes, and as I said, the main spire that is in the center is a very light thing, was designed by Bois-le-Duc, and it wasn't installed until the 1920s.
And I just said,
Believe it or
I
not.
probably misspoke when I said a century ago, because it was probably more like a century and a half ago or a century and a quarter ago, but because it's already 2020 now.
Yep.
But that's,
Yeah, I think people would become very fascinated to follow the reconstruction and what they're doing there, because they're fashioning all of the wood beams by hand.
Wow.
Much like they were when they constructed to begin with.
Wow. They're trying to go back to as much of the authentic process
in a
as
Gothic
possible.
cathedral, you have this vault, which is a pointed vault, and on top of that you build a structure, which is like toothpicks in comparison with the scale of the Gothic cathedral, of wood to hold the slate roof that goes on top of the vault.
Oh, that's interesting. I wonder how many people ever think about that. Yes, the interior, you see all of these
You see all
points,
the stonework.
but you don't see that from the exterior at all.
The exterior is a slate roof, and that slate roof is covering the vaults with a carved wooden beam structure that sits on the top of the walls.
Wow.
And that structure, both the vault and the wooden beam structure, couldn't stand there without the flying buttress. The building would collapse.
For sure.
Yep. Yeah.
So now I'm thinking about something else that we weren't planning on talking about today, and that is talk about going back to the original way of producing the artifacts, the original way of producing the building. Reminds me of another treasure we have here in Philadelphia, the Swedenborgian Cathedral in Brynathan, where they have gone back 100% to the craftsmanship, to the way that the Gothic buildings were constructed.
Yep.
And even discovering things about stained glass that civilization had lost, and leaded glass. Yep. Yep.
And you mentioned stained glass, and I showed one of the works of stained glass that Ferness was doing, and that leads you to Frank Lloyd Wright and his stained glass.
Oh yeah.
And we'll be able to connect those dots of Philadelphia and Chicago with the next session that we do.
That's right.
Which is very interesting because of where Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright came from, which we'll talk about in the next session.
You'll get to their roots.
I don't want to give it away.
No, I know, but we're very lucky that we're going to be able to go in that direction next time. And I'm also enjoying the relaxedness of these conversations we're having, because I know you set out to talk about a certain topic, and before you know it, we're going all over the world.
That's true.
So I'm really happy with that situation. Do you want to tell us anything about the book?
Well, the book covers these topics. It's illustrated. It has pictures of all of the various buildings that are in it. I wrote it in a very familiar kind of a style, telling stories, so that people would enjoy the book as much as storytelling about where these people came from and how they came into being, and then connected as we just did with Philadelphia and Boston, the political, cultural, economic conditions that spurred these architects to come to the surface.
Right.
Why did they come about in the first place?
And I know people have told me, I'm aware of it too, that this is a book about architecture and American history, written for the layman, not written for architecture students, not written for other architects. And people have told me how engaging and enjoyable and relaxed and humorous it is, that it's very easy to read, and it's a great bedside table book because you only have to read a chapter at a time.
That's true. You can go from city to city and learn about the people.
Pick up whichever city you're interested in. You want to read about Pasadena or Detroit or whatever.
Yep.
Just read that chapter. Yeah. So people shouldn't be frightened that it's going to be an architectural tome or treatise. It's definitely a pleasant thing. We've been really lucky to have you doing this, Charlie, and we have another bunch of shows ahead to talk about all these other great places. Yep. I'm looking forward to talking about Chicago. So thank you very much, and thank you, audience, for being with us. Join us next time when we'll redirect our focus to the Midwest, particularly, as Charlie said, Chicago, to illustrate the works of Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright, who were two visionary architects who took both the urban and suburban environments into entirely new directions. Here's a hint. One of those directions was upward. We'll see you then.